No, we're not transitioning away from anything. We are hurtling. This isn't a slow transition. We are just like pedal to the metal, full transition to fossil fuels. In the 90s, there was some basis to that because it was the idea that gas was going to replace coal. And the 90s was some time ago.
Shut your mouth.
Yeah. I don't remember that because I was born in 2012. There was some merit, but it is now a concept that is being, like, it's way past its use-by date.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to be talking about gas in the Northern Territory.
Doctors from the Northern Territory are the latest to urge the federal government to stop the Beetaloo Basin gas project.
A large delegation of doctors converged on Parliament House in Canberra today to protest against fossil fuel projects in the Northern Territory.
We cannot afford to have another new fossil fuel project.
Plans to build an industrial hub at Middle Arm in Darwin Harbour,
including potential hydrogen plants, carbon capture and storage. And it shows Tamboran Gas, the major player in Beetaloo fracking, is a potential anchor tenant.
Albanese government will provide $1.5 billion in planned equity to support the development of the Middle Arm precinct.
Yes, associated with fossil fuels. But 5 of the projects, 5 of the 6 proponents are hydrogen, critical minerals, green ammonia and solar companies.
There will still be demand for gas while we make the transition. There are some.
This project is an absolute disaster. It'll release a catastrophic amount of emissions.
Fracking of the Beetaloo Basin will release a 1.4 billion tonne carbon bomb of carbon emissions, which we can't offset.
Bagging out a development that supports zero and lower emissions from a place overwhelmingly powered by coal and oil, the hypocrisy is breathtaking.
Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, Natasha Fyles, in a recent National Press Club address, said that gas is a reliable energy source on the pathway to transitioning from coal and oil towards renewables. This is a line you might have heard frequently, and it's especially touted by the gas industry to justify its expansion while supposedly committing to net zero emissions. Tamboran Resources' proposed LNG processing and export facility in the Northern Territory at the so-called Middle Arm Sustainable Development Precinct is being sold to the Australian people using this same justification, that somehow more gas will equal less emissions. But recent research from the Australia Institute shows that this is dangerously false. To take us through just how bad this proposal is, I'm talking to Climate and Energy Director Polly Hemming. G'day, Polly.
G'day, Ab. How you going?
So, Polly, can you tell us quickly, to begin with, what Middle Arm actually is?
Yeah, Middle Arm is it's an entire hub or precinct on the Darwin Harbour in the Northern Territory, and it's been described as a sustainable development precinct by both the Northern Territory and federal governments. It's been around, or the proposal has been around for a few years. It's sort of, well, the operations are always very vague. It's this hub where we're going to have apparently sustainable manufacturing and green hydrogen processing and exports. But the Northern Territory government first started describing it as an industrial petrochemicals facility as early as 2018. And
that's quite a bit different from a sustainable hub.
It's a sustainable petrochemical hub. Yeah, well, that language sort of conveniently disappeared. I suppose as the rhetoric around, climate became or changed in Australia, and it suddenly turned into this sustainable hub. So either way, the federal government has committed $1.5 billion to this body of infrastructure that houses a number of different facilities.
We know our economic future needs to be powered by renewable and lower emissions energy, and that's what Middle Arm is all about. It's being developed to attract industries that reflect the economy we want to build. Solar, hydrogen, minerals processing, advanced manufacturing, carbon capture and storage. Middle Arm is a part of our master plan for growth in the Territory.
The Northern Territory was also talking about it as a petrochemical and gas facility until the time of the most recent election, at which time they realised that was on the nose, and they did find and replace on all the documents and all the websites, and they replaced the words gas with sustainable development region. The Prime Minister today is talking about it as a marine facility or something, but this is news. It's gobbledygook. It's greenwashing. It's clearly a gas project.
But let's be very clear. Middle Arm is far from sustainable. The driving force behind the whole development is gas extracted from new fields in the Beetaloo.
So let's dig into this idea that it's some kind of a sustainability hub. It started out, as he said, with very different beginnings. How far away is it from those beginnings in reality?
Well, you'll be surprised to learn that it seems to be all about gas, one of the NT's favourite things. And it already has 2 gas facilities on it. It's got a Santos and Ichthys gas project. So it's never been sustainable to begin with. And when I say that this precinct, the area of Middle Arm has these 2 facilities. And despite claims by the Minister for Infrastructure, Catherine King, saying that the federal government's subsidy of this facility was not a fossil fuel subsidy, we now have seen FOI documents where the Department of Environment is describing Middle Arm as a key enabler of gas from the Beetaloo Basin. The Northern Territory government, has never really denied that it's going to be about gas. It just sort of emphasises that it's about green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage too. And just in case there is any doubt at all, now Tamboran, this oil and gas company, have said that they are going to be setting up this gas processing and export facility at Middle Arm using gas from the Beetaloo Basin.
You just said then it's like an export hub. I thought the Northern Territory had kind of said when it was talking about why we needed this, that it was going to be supplying domestic gas to Australia. Is that not the case anymore?
That's what they've said all along, and Beetaloo has always been touted by, even under the coalition government, that the gas from the Beetaloo was going to help provide energy security in Australia, that we're running out of gas in the eastern states and so we need to find new sources. Again, really conveniently, this Tamboran facility, when it's running at full capacity, it's anticipating using... Well, it has capacity to use 90% of the gas extracted from the Beetaloo Basin, which suggests that actually, no, it's probably not for domestic use. It's being very much earmarked for export. And again, those FOI documents say that this is for export. The Northern Territory government itself has said that gas from Beetaloo is for export as well. So there's a lot of contradictions going on there.
But probably safe to say it's not really going to help with Australia's energy security or reducing our gas bills.
Well, no. And if you look at when Tamboran is actually wanting to start production, or it will be at full production, it's not until the 2030s. So for a start, we don't have a gas shortage in Australia. Any gas shortage is not going to be met by gas from the Beetaloo Basin, which is not coming online for some time.
Anytime soon.
Yeah.
So we're not just digging and shipping, but we're digging, processing, refining, manufacturing and then shipping, creating long-term jobs for Territorians up and along the value chain.
Quite simply, if we're talking about domestic demand, we don't need the gas. We've seen gas usage in electricity system halve. So what we're seeing is a massive transition out of gas in the electricity system.
So tell us about this Tamboran project itself. What's the proposal?
The Tamboran LNG plant, as I said, is using Beetaloo gas or gas extracted from the Beetaloo Basin via fracking, and it's aiming to produce up to 20 million tonnes of LNG per year for export. And if you want to think about that in terms of emissions, like at full capacity, if you look at all those life cycle emissions, that's the emissions that come from extracting the gas, like the gas that leaks out in the process, transporting it, processing it, and then combusting it, whether it's here in Australia or elsewhere. That's 81 million tonnes of CO2 every year. And a useful way of thinking about that is it would be like adding 12 new coal-fired power stations to the world. If you wanted to look at emissions just in Australia, it would be producing 21 million tonnes of those life cycle emissions would happen on our shores, and that's the equivalent of adding 3 new coal-fired power stations.
3 new coal-fired power stations, just from the emissions here.
Yep, the emissions onshore.
Okay, so, that doesn't really sound good for climate change.
Doesn't sound that sustainable.
It doesn't sound that sustainable either. There's been a lot of claims about this lowering emissions. I mean, from what I'm hearing, it's going to increase emissions, Polly.
It seems crazy that I have to say that you are not reducing emissions if you are... if you're creating...
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's not funny, but...
It's not funny, but it also is... It's basic maths. Yeah, the idea that anyone is treating this is serious. Anytime the government or industry says this, it should just be dismissed out of hand. So, no, it is putting emissions into the atmosphere. It's not lowering emissions. What the proponents say and what government says, the Northern Territory government, is that, well, they're making a comparison with coal-fired power stations. So this would have lower emissions than a coal-fired power station. To be clear, no one's building new coal-fired power stations in Australia. Most of them are being phased out. There's a broad acknowledgement that we need a timeline for phasing them out. This gas is also not, as we've said, for the eastern states. Fracking is expensive. It's expensive to kind of pipe it over to the other side of Australia. So it's not only not providing energy security, it's not lowering emissions. It is just increasing emissions. And we know, we're told constantly by scientists, by the UN Secretary General, that we're in the era now of global boiling. We need to stop opening up new gas basins. We need to stop burning fossil fuels as fast as we can. This is in no way aligned with Australia's climate target, let alone the basic science of what's needed to stop making climate change worse.
Yeah, it feels like particularly the UN Secretary General could not have been clearer. Like, no new fossil fuel projects. You can't be more straightforward than that about what is needed, and that's what this is. It's a brand new one. Like, we don't need it.
It's a whole new, exactly. It's a whole, the Beetaloo Basin is a whole new gas basin. It will be one of the biggest untapped gas reservoirs in the world. We don't need it.
The world must phase out fossil fuels in a just and equitable way, moving to leave oil, coal and gas in the ground where they belong.
The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. The air is unbreathable, the heat is unbearable, and the level of fossil fuel profits and climate inaction is unacceptable.
So, I want to move now to carbon offsets, because I know when we're talking about middle arm, a lot of the arguments about why this will help lower emissions is that it's going to have carbon offsets. Can you just unpack for me why that is problematic?
Sure. So it's not Middle Arm itself. It would have to be this Tamboran plant, because when the safeguard mechanism was introduced, it was established that projects attached to new gas basins like the Beetaloo would have to offset. They'd have to be net zero from day one. But that doesn't actually mean all their emissions from the products that are extracted and then combusted offshore. So for, right off the bat, we're not talking about it being the whole thing being net zero. It's just some emissions will have to be offset here in Australia, and then theoretically they'll be carbon neutral. Offsets are not a replacement for not emitting in the first place. We have established that a majority of offsets are flawed. They're not being used to offset the entirety of emissions. You can't offset fossil fuel emissions with land-based carbon offsets. That's just physics. So it's problematic in a lot of ways, and the International Energy Agency established recently that Australia's dramatically underestimating the amount of fugitive emissions that are coming from our coal mines, but we also don't know how much are actually leaking out from gas basins or gas wells or through production.
And that would be methane emissions, right, which in itself is like, that's a very powerful greenhouse gas, particularly in the short term. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. So in the short term, it has a much higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So if that's leaking out willy-nilly all over the place across the Northern Territory, that's incredibly dangerous. The only surefire way to ensure that gas developments have no impact on the climate is to not open up new gas basins.
Can't be more straightforward than that.
Almost 100 scientists and experts urged the Northern Territory to abandon its plans in an open letter today.
No, we don't want fracking at all. We believe we're not being listened to. Our voices are not being heard. In communities, it is clear that the government has not done a proper job of making sure Aboriginal people understand the huge impact fracking will have on our country.
Calling on the government to stop the Middle Arm project and the fracking of the Beetaloo Basin and so many other gas projects.
We finally have a government that accepts the science on climate change. They're very open with that. They'll say, we accept the science. They just won't listen to scientists.
Fracking of the Beetaloo Basin will release a 1.4 billion tonne carbon bomb of carbon emissions, which we can't offset and we can't mitigate, and it will blow out of the water any other attempt that this country makes to mitigate its emissions.
There have been calls from the crossbench and the community to drop support for the project. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a number of independents and the Greens have expressed significant concern about what Middle Arm is actually facilitating. And, I mean, they've expressed concern about Beetaloo as well, but Middle Arm in particular recently, just because it is the recipient of that huge $1.5 billion. But it's not just the crossbench, it's increasing members of the community. There was a delegation of doctors that recently came to Canberra to express their concern not just about the climate impact, but the health impacts of having this massive gas processing plant so close to residential areas. And it's really great to see both the community and crossbenchers trying to hold the government to account on this, because there are a lot of unanswered questions. And when it was established that Middle Arm was a gas facility, the government blocked an inquiry, a Senate inquiry into Middle Arm. They voted with the coalition. And what seems to have happened is now the government has kind of flipped and acknowledged that Middle Arm, yes, it is for gas, but we need gas in the energy mix in the future. So now they're not bothering to deny it anymore, but they are running those, industry lines where gas is a transition fuel and we will need it into the future.
So this idea of a transition fuel, we hear it time and time again with gas, but if we're building new gas basins, Polly, there is no transition. We're not transitioning to anything. We're still transitioning into fossil fuels. There's no move away from it.
No, we're not transitioning away from anything. We are hurtling. This isn't a slow transition. We are just pedal to the metal, full transition to fossil fuels. In the 90s, there was some basis to that because it was the idea that gas was going to replace coal. And the 90s was some time ago.
Shut your mouth.
Yeah. I don't remember that because I was born in 2012. There was some merit, but it is now a concept that is being, it's way past its use-by date, that idea now. And, as you say, all this gas is not coming online for a number of years, long after we should have met our climate targets, long after we should have transitioned away. So it's manifestly untrue that it has any role to play in the transition, new gas that is. Yes, it will be part of the mix as we transition away, but we have ample supply to do that.
Yeah. The Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen was on the radio this morning talking about a new agreement with California, which is the 5th largest economy in the world, that focuses on cooperation on climate action and biodiversity. That all sounds great on the surface of it, and, we've got a lot of time to make up for in terms of investing in renewables and domestically changing our electricity system over to renewables and things like that. But the US is kind of heavily investing in these kinds of things as part of its Inflation Reduction Act. We do have a lot of catch-up. But again, can you just put that in context with these projects that we're talking about?
Yeah, you've kind of highlighted, if I can sound really cynical, I think the government's strategy, and this has been our strategy for decades, where we focus solely on domestic emissions. And so we are doing some things in Australia to decarbonise our electricity grid. We did introduce the safeguard mechanism, which, you know, we could talk about that for a long time, but it's a way of saying that things are happening here in Australia, and of course our accounting means we don't have to account for the fossil fuels that we export. But in the meantime, we are still approving new gas and coal projects that are going into the middle of this century that are producing billions and billions of tonnes of CO2 offshore. So it's great that things are happening in Australia, and announcements like this are really promising, but, you know, that it's a drop in the water, what we're doing in Australia versus the impact that we're having on global climate change with our exports.
Yeah. So look over here at the shiny renewables and please ignore the puffing away
the
background of...
Yeah, well, you see everywhere Australia's going to be a renewable energy superpower, and we're saying that we're going to host a UN climate conference off the back of this because we've changed. We're back on the world stage. We're out of the naughty corner. You talk to anyone else in the international community about what Australia is doing, and there's a nod of the head to what we're doing domestically. That all sounds great, but everyone is still very much aware of the fact that we are still a petrostate, and we are still going around to other countries like India or South Korea recently trying to sell our gas and coal to them.
Creating long-term jobs for Territorians up and along the value chain.
The gas that's coming out, the jobs that are going to be available, anywhere between 3,000 to 6,000 jobs available through the development of this industry over the next 20 years.
The development will see gas processed in Darwin, bringing 600 jobs to the top end.
I want to come back to the Northern Territory to finish up. So it seems to me that a lot of this investment and new fossil fuel projects are centred around the Northern Territory. Why does fossil fuel expansion seem to be a particular problem in the Territory?
It's an excellent question, Eb. I think WA faces the same issue, and if I can put it down to its simplest element, it just seems like rampant state capture. And I say that because both the Northern Territory and the federal governments often talk about the economic benefits of gas to this area, but it's really not a huge employer apart from that initial construction phase. But if you look at the modelling that the NT government did, the employment benefits are actually much smaller than what they're stating.
Certainly compared to the risks of climate change for the Northern Territory.
Well, exactly, yeah. It's the most vulnerable areas that seem to be doubling down on this stuff. But the Northern Territory government often, it prides itself on the fact that the NT is a tourist attraction. Petrostate doesn't look great on a postcard. Huge gas processing facility on the Darwin Harbour, which is beautiful, by the way. I still live in Darwin. That's not a great tourist attraction. You know, the risk is that if the Northern Territory keeps pursuing a very narrow kind of industry, it's not diversifying its economy. It's putting all its eggs in this one highly polluting basket that as we know, Australia-wide doesn't pay its fair share in terms of tax, royalties, benefits to the local community. It certainly doesn't pay for things like hospitals and schools, as we're told. You know, there's no direct link where the money is being directly funneled into them.
And they are absolutely raking in windfall profits as well. It's really a crime how little revenue Australia itself gets from this resource that we collectively own. I feel like if we are going to keep doing this, can we at least make some money from it so that we can invest in places like the Northern Territory, make sure people don't die in the middle of heat waves because they don't have air conditioning or adequate accommodation, for example.
Yeah, or clean drinking water that isn't contaminated by fracking. And that's a really good point. So the more royalties that the gas industry pays in the NT, the less GST they get from the Commonwealth. So there's actually no real incentive to try and hold gas companies or resources companies to account and have adequate royalty regimes coming in, because then they get limited income from elsewhere. So yet again, we see gas companies getting a free ride in Australia and exploiting the states and territories at an individual level as well. Of course, you see former politicians popping up on the boards or being given jobs by these organisations after the fact. So I wouldn't discount the idea of state capture is a very real thing. It's in mining and extraction is kind of in our blood culturally.
Well, thanks, Polly. That has been a very illuminating discussion.
Thanks, Em.
This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 16th of August 2023, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. If you love the Follow the Money podcast and love hearing about fossil fuel expansion and explaining why this is all a very bad idea, you can go and get the facts and figures yourself at our website. And also, if you can, please chip in to fund research that matters. You can donate at australiainstitute.org.au and support all of Polly and the climate and energy team's excellent work. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Polly Hemming is at Polly J Hemming. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McPhee from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.